She laughed with her lover at the board meeting, right there in front of everyone, her voice sharp and mocking, while I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table. She leaned across to him, whispered something, and then laughed loud enough for the room to hear. The message was clear. I was nobody, irrelevant, a man whose words meant nothing. People glanced at me with smirks. Others tried to hide their amusement, but the humiliation hung thick in the air. They thought I would shrink into silence. They thought I would break. But only a few minutes later, the pen would hit the paper, and everything they believed about me would collapse. Subscribe, hit that like button, and leave a comment, because you won't want to miss what happened next. The morning had started like any other, but by the time I walked into that conference room, I already felt the weight of eyes on me. The building itself was polished to perfection, marble floors gleaming under bright fluorescent light, glass walls reflecting every move, and the faint hum of air conditioning giving the place an icy chill. It was the headquarters of one of the largest investment firms in the city, a place where fortunes were made or destroyed with the stroke of a pen. The long table stretched across the room, lined with sleek leather chairs, and at its head sat men and women whose signatures carried the power of millions. I knew walking in that this was no ordinary meeting. It was the kind of gathering where reputations were measured, weighed, and judged in silence before a single word was spoken. I arrived early, as I always did, my notes neatly stacked, my suit pressed. My position at the table was not at the head, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the opportunity, the possibility that today could change the course of everything I had been working toward. Yet, from the moment I entered, I felt her eyes on me. Sarah, my wife. Her presence was both familiar and foreign. She was radiant, dressed in a fitted gray dress that matched her sharpness. Her blonde hair styled perfectly, her smile disarming as always. But her smile wasn't for me. It was for him. Daniel, a man I had known only in passing before this day, but a man whose closeness to her was now impossible to ignore. They sat side by side, their chairs angled slightly toward each other, as though the rest of the room barely existed. She leaned close, whispering in his ear, her laugh ringing out like a bell. I watched her hand brush his sleeve, casual, unashamed, deliberate. It was a scene staged not in secret shadows, but right in front of everyone, as if to make a statement. That I was powerless, that she had chosen her place and it was not beside me. My chest tightened, but my face remained still, my posture upright, my hands folded neatly on the table. Years of learning how to master silence served me well in that moment. I didn't flinch. I didn't respond. I let her have her laughter, her mockery. The others around the table noticed. Of course they noticed. People who live in the world of business notice everything, every glance, every tremor of the hand, every slip of expression. Some smirked behind their coffee cups. Some exchanged quiet looks, as though silently agreeing that the show unfolding before them was amusing. Sarah, my own wife, ensured that amusement had a target me. Her voice carried again, louder this time, just as the lead investor entered the room. Some people don't even know why they're here, she said, her eyes sliding toward me as if the jab were subtle. The laughter that followed wasn't subtle. Daniel chuckled, low and confident, while two of the assistants at the far end of the room tried and failed to suppress their grins. I sat in silence, but inside me the air grew colder. It wasn't rage. Rage would have been too easy, too obvious. It was something sharper, something that cut deeper and cleaner than anger. It was clarity. I looked around the room, at the polished surfaces, the gleaming watches on wrists, the contracts waiting to be signed. Every detail sharpened in my vision, every sound amplified. Sarah thought she had me cornered, thought she had stripped me of dignity. But I knew something she didn't, and that knowledge sat in me like a quiet storm waiting to break. I met her eyes once, only once, across that table. For a fraction of a second, her laughter faltered. It was almost imperceptible, but I caught it, the momentary flicker when she realized that my silence was not defeat. My silence was patience. My silence was preparation. The meeting began, voices filling the room with rehearsed pitches and well-polished presentations. Papers shuffled, glasses of water clinked, screens lit up with graphs and numbers. I listened, I observed, I waited. Sarah and Daniel leaned closer to one another, their private world on display, their confidence swelling with every passing minute. They thought the outcome was already written. They thought they knew where the power lay. And all the while, I sat in the shadows of their laughter, still as stone, waiting for the right moment to step into the light. The meeting carried on with a rhythm that felt rehearsed, voices rising and falling like instruments in a well-practiced symphony. Yet underneath it all there was an edge, a current of anticipation that even the most polished executive in that room couldn't quite conceal. The lead investor, Charles Whitman, sat near the head of the table, his silver hair neatly combed, his expression sharp and unreadable as he leafed through the presentation materials. His reputation was legendary. A man who could double a fortune with a signature or sink an empire with a frown. The air itself seemed to bend toward him, everyone angling their words, their charm, their strategies in his direction. And yet, though all eyes sought him, mine wandered to Sarah. She leaned closer to Daniel as if the meeting itself were secondary entertainment. Her laughter punctuated the room like a hammer striking glass, every chuckle slicing deeper than the last. Daniel, tall and broad-shouldered in his tailored charcoal suit, basked in it, flashing his confident smile as if the world itself bowed at his command. He spoke loudly, over-enunciating his points, gesturing grandly, and Sarah nodded as though his words were golden. Their whispers, though meant to be private, carried across the polished table. I caught fragments. He's out of his league. Why is he even here? Phrases designed to twist the knife, to reduce me to nothing in the eyes of the others. My pulse throbbed in my ears, but my hands remained folded neatly, my gaze steady on the documents in front of me. I forced my breathing into calm, even rhythm, the kind of control that only comes when humiliation is not new but familiar. The others noticed, of course. They always notice. A junior partner across the table smirked faintly. A woman near the window bit her lip as though holding back a laugh. Even Charles's assistant, a man usually stoic, shifted in his chair with the hint of a grin. The spectacle Sarah created was working, at least on the surface. But I knew that in rooms like this, surface impressions could dissolve in an instant. Every look, every gesture, every pause carried weight, and those who underestimated silence often lived to regret it. The presentation moved on, numbers flashing on screens, graphs pointing skyward, promises of growth and returns echoing off the glass walls. Daniel spoke with the polish of someone accustomed to admiration, and Sarah's eyes gleamed with pride as she watched him. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs deliberately, radiating the smug assurance of a woman who believed she had chosen the winning side. When she caught my eye, she tilted her chin slightly, a silent gesture of superiority, a reminder that in her mind I was beneath her, beneath all of them. I met her stare without blinking. She faltered for half a second, then masked it with another laugh. But the seed of doubt was there now, faint and unacknowledged, yet planted nonetheless. The voices around the table blurred into one another, yet I absorbed every detail. The way Charles's gaze hardened when Daniel spoke too long without substance. The slight narrowing of his wife Evelyn's eyes, a woman seated quietly a few chairs away, her elegant hands folded on the table as she listened more intently than anyone else. Most ignored her presence, seeing only Charles, but I saw the way her attention moved, sharp and deliberate. She noticed things others missed. She noticed the arrogance, the overconfidence, the whispering that bled into disrespect. And I noticed her noticing. The longer the meeting went, the more the atmosphere thickened. Sarah's voice grew bolder, Daniel's confidence inflated like a balloon, and the others adjusted themselves to the performance, some laughing with them, others choosing silence rather than risk offense. I remained still, a figure in the shadows, offering nothing, waiting. When I finally spoke, my voice was low but carried clearly across the table. It was not a grand speech, not a challenge, just a single clarification about a figure on one of the slides. The room stilled for a moment, surprised at the interruption. Charles turned his eyes toward me, sharp and weighing. I met his gaze without flinching. That projection, I said evenly, assumes reinvestment at a rate that history doesn't support. If you adjust it to a realistic benchmark, the returns are lower. Much lower. The silence that followed was thicker than Sarah's laughter had been. Daniel shifted, his polished presentation faltering for the first time. Sarah's lips pressed together, her smile flickering. The others glanced between us, their curiosity now sharpened. Charles did not speak, but Evelyn's lips curved into the faintest smile, a smile no one else seemed to notice. I leaned back, saying nothing more, letting the weight of truth linger. The meeting continued, but the energy had shifted. Subtly, invisibly, but unmistakably, the current was no longer running only in one direction. Eyes began to turn toward me more often. Questions lingered a second longer before moving on. And through it all, Sarah laughed a little too loudly, a little too quickly, as if trying to drown out what she herself had just begun to fear. The rhythm of the meeting shifted in ways so subtle most of the people in that room failed to grasp it, but I felt it with every fiber of my being. The confidence that had once radiated from Sarah and Daniel began to fray at the edges, though they covered it with louder laughs and bolder words. Their act was theater, but the audience had started to glance elsewhere. Even Charles, the man whose approval everyone sought, leaned back in his chair more often. His fingers steepled under his chin as he regarded each speaker with cool detachment. His silence was dangerous. Silence in a man of his influence always was. I had been around long enough to know that when men like him fell quiet, they were calculating, weighing, shifting loyalties in their minds without a hint of expression. I watched Evelyn, his wife, more closely now. Her presence at the table was unusual enough, but her attention was the detail that mattered. She missed nothing. Every smirk Sarah threw in my direction, every overconfident flourish of Daniel's hand, every dismissive chuckle. She absorbed it all. And unlike the others, she didn't smile. Her gaze was steady, sharp, and to my surprise, it often lingered on me. The meeting pressed on with presentations, charts, and rehearsed speeches, but the energy in the room thickened like fog. Daniel began another long pitch, his voice polished but his arguments stretching thin. He clicked through slides that promised growth so exaggerated it bordered on fantasy, his tone rising as though volume could disguise the weakness of his numbers. Sarah leaned in, encouraging him, laughing at all the right moments, tossing her hair back with the careless confidence of someone convinced the game was already won. She even made a show of rolling her eyes toward me, as if to remind everyone that I was the outsider, the man meant to be silent while others decided the future. Her laugh rang out again, sharp, almost desperate in its brightness. The others chuckled along politely, though less freely now. Some of them avoided looking at me altogether, as though acknowledging me would disturb the performance Sarah and Daniel had staged. I remained calm, still, my notes untouched. I wanted them to underestimate me. I wanted Sarah to believe she had erased me from the story unfolding in that room. Because the longer she believed it, the sharper the turn would be when truth revealed itself. A lull settled after Daniel's speech, a silence heavier than applause. He cleared his throat, perhaps expecting immediate praise, but none came. Charles finally spoke, his voice measured, deliberate. "Ambitious projections," he said, his eyes flicking briefly to me before returning to Daniel. "Perhaps too ambitious." The words hung in the air like a stone dropped into still water. Daniel's smile faltered, and Sarah's fingers clenched tighter around her pen. The atmosphere cracked just slightly, but enough for everyone to feel it. Evelyn shifted then, the faintest movement, yet it drew my attention like a spark in the dark. She leaned forward, her voice soft but cutting through the silence. "I'd like to hear more from him," she said, her eyes turning to me. The room turned with her. Dozens of eyes fixed on me at once, curious, some doubtful, some surprised. Sarah froze, her laughter choking off mid-breath. Daniel glanced at her, his confidence collapsing in real time. I straightened in my chair, not with arrogance, but with quiet certainty. I didn't raise my voice, didn't try to dominate. I simply spoke. "Projections are only as strong as the foundation beneath them," I said, pointing calmly to the figures on the screen. "If you adjust for volatility and factor in real reinvestment history, The growth curve looks less glamorous but more honest. And honesty is the only thing that can sustain a partnership. My words were not loud, but they carried. The silence that followed was different now. Not awkward, not mocking, but weighted with consideration. Evelyn nodded once, just slightly, but with a clarity that pierced through the room. Charles's gaze lingered on me longer than it had all day. Around the table, people shifted, their postures changing, their eyes flicking between me and Sarah as though recalculating the balance of power. Sarah tried to laugh again, but it sounded thin, brittle, and the sound died quickly in the air. Her hand reached for Daniel's arm as if anchoring herself, but he pulled away almost imperceptibly, his confidence unraveling thread by thread. For the first time since I walked into that room, she looked uncertain. The air grew heavy with expectation, though no one dared to say aloud what they were beginning to sense. Something was tilting, shifting, and the woman who had mocked me so easily just minutes ago now sat in silence, her eyes darting nervously toward the man she thought she could rely on. But he had his own doubts now, and in those doubts she found no comfort. The meeting pressed forward, but the energy no longer belonged to them. It hovered elsewhere, waiting for the next move, the next revelation, the next strike of truth that would shatter the performance and leave nothing but reality exposed. The silence after Evelyn's words lingered like a storm cloud, heavy and expectant. I felt every eye on me, but I refused to rush. I had learned long ago that silence, when wielded carefully, could speak louder than 1,000 words. Sarah sat across the table, her expression shifting rapidly between disbelief and panic, her fingers fidgeting with the pen she had earlier wielded like a dagger against me. Daniel adjusted his tie, his bravado slipping into unease as the balance of the room began to change. I leaned forward slowly, my tone calm, my words deliberate, every syllable placed with precision. "The truth is simple," I said, my gaze sweeping the room. "Numbers don't need to be dressed up. They don't need illusions. What matters isn't how high you can make the projection soar, but how firmly you can hold it when reality presses against it. That's how partnerships endure." The words weren't grand or theatrical, but in their simplicity they struck deeper than Daniel's entire polished presentation. Evelyn nodded again, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully, and her approval carried more weight than any applause could have. For years, everyone in the industry whispered that while Charles signed the checks, Evelyn often guided the hand that held the pen. Her word was not official, but it was decisive. Sarah's face paled as she realized this, and her laugh, the one she had clung to like armor, was gone entirely now. Daniel attempted to salvage his ground, raising his voice, pointing back to his slides, forcing confidence he no longer possessed. "With respect," he said, his words hurried. "Those adjustments underestimate potential. You can't grow if you only plan for the worst." But his voice lacked conviction, and even he seemed unconvinced by his own defense. Charles leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, his eyes flicking between me, Daniel, and finally Evelyn. It was in that moment Evelyn spoke again, her voice steady, carrying authority without needing to rise. "Potential is worthless without trust," she said, "and trust is built on truth." She picked up the pen that had been resting by her folder, her hand steady as the air in the room froze. Everyone knew what that pen meant. Contracts lay ready on the table, agreements that had the power to shift millions, to decide the winners and losers of this meeting. Sarah's mouth fell open, her eyes widening as Evelyn reached across and signed her name on the document in front of me. The sound of pen on paper was louder than thunder. The room gasped collectively, a ripple of shock and disbelief that echoed off the glass walls. Daniel's shoulders collapsed as if the air had been punched from him. Sarah sat motionless, her skin pale, her lips trembling, her eyes fixed on the signature that sealed her humiliation. In an instant, everything she had mocked, everything she had laughed at, collapsed. The man she had dismissed as nothing now held the contract, the partnership, the power. The meeting erupted in murmurs, some leaning forward to see the paper, others whispering furiously to one another. Assistants scribbled notes, executives exchanged stunned glances, and the atmosphere turned electric with realization. Sarah tried to speak, her voice breaking as she stammered. But he can't. Her words died in the air, cut off by the silence that followed Evelyn's action. Daniel stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, his jaw tight with humiliation. He muttered something under his breath, but no one listened. All attention was on me now, the man who had been invisible at the start of the meeting and who now stood at its center. I gathered my notes calmly, sliding the freshly signed contract into my folder with deliberate precision. I didn't need to gloat, didn't need to smile or laugh. The power was in the stillness, in the fact that I had said little and done less, yet emerged holding everything that mattered. Sarah finally found her voice, desperate and trembling. "This isn't fair," she whispered, her eyes darting between me and Evelyn, searching for a lifeline that no longer existed. "You can't just—" But she stopped herself, realizing how small her words sounded in a room where her laughter had once been so loud. No one defended her. No one even looked at her. Daniel had already stepped back, his gaze fixed on the floor, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Charles rose finally, his expression as calm as stone. He placed a hand on Evelyn's shoulder, a gesture that said more than any speech could have. Her choice was his choice, and the matter was settled. The others followed suit, shifting their attention, adjusting their loyalties, recalculating in real time who held the power. And it was no longer Sarah, no longer Daniel. I stood, gathering my things, and for the first time that day, I allowed myself a final glance at Sarah. She met my eyes, and in them I saw the full weight of her realization crash down on her. The laughter she had used to cut me apart now turned into the silence that destroyed her. She had mocked me, dismissed me, betrayed me, and in return, she had been left with nothing but humiliation, abandoned by the very man she thought was her triumph. I walked out of that room not with victory carved in loud words or gestures, but with the quiet strength of a man who no longer needed to explain himself. And in that moment, I understood something I would never forget. Silence, when timed perfectly, can roar louder than any insult. Subscribe, like, and leave a comment if you want to hear more stories where betrayal collapses in the face of quiet truth.